from Israel.
Here we go.
Oh, yes.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. You can all hear me?
Good evening. Yes, we can.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Irving Learman. I'm in Petach Tikva, together with Frank. We're both in Petach Tikva. So we'd like to welcome everybody. And first of all, to start off by thanking Frank and Paul for organizing these shiurim. I think it's a wonderful thing. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Shulchan Aruch. The title, as you can see, of the talk is Setting the Table for the Shulchan Aruch, which is a bit of a pun, but it's really the story behind the Shulchan Aruch. And if I just move down the screen, I just want to say a few things about the Shulchan Aruch. We've all heard of the Shulchan Aruch. Many of us study the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the book of halachot governing the daily life of every Jew. The Shulchan Aruch was written by Rabbi Yosef.
You should start with the telling that the tour was based on the Shulchan Aruch was based on the tour. Perhaps you tell that first.
Yes, we'll get to that a little bit later, Frank. What I would like to request, please, if you have questions, if you can try and have a few minutes at the end to deal with the questions. But I just want to give this little introduction about the Shulchan Aruch. That it was written 450 years ago, and yet it's still running our day-to-day life of every Jew. And as you will, I'm sure, know, that the Shulchan Aruch consists of 4 volumes: the Orach Chaim, which is the most popular, which deals with the everyday laws of prayers of the synagogue and the Sabbath on the Shabbat, and the Chagim. The Yoredea, which deals with all sorts of different isurim, like to do with shchita and kashrut, to do with mikveh and idolatry, nadarim, tzedakah, studying of Torah, mourning. This is the Yoredea. The 3rd volume is the Even HaEzer, which deals with marital laws, getting married, divorce, this sort of thing. And the Choshen Mishpat deals with monetary matters. So since its first publication, it's been the reference and basis for all halacha. No halacha is decided without reference to the Shulchan Aruch, and hundreds of books have been written on or around the Shulchan Aruch right up to the present day. To obtain smicha, every rabbi spends years studying and being tested on the Shulchan Aruch. So here's an example of what the Shulchan Aruch looks like. It's in many formats, but basically, here you can see here, it's rather small, but the Shulchan Aruch Chaim. And here's an example from the Hilchot Sukkah, where you have different dinim. You can see here, Seif Aleph, Seif Bet, Seif Gimel, Seif Dalet, Seif Hey, where and the halacha for each particular point is written in 1 or 2 brief sentences, saying this is allowed, this is not allowed, this sort of thing. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch looks like. And if you look at the full Shulchan Aruch, which is you find on the bookshelf, in the shul, in the library, this is the what it looks like on the page. You can see it's rather a very full page. In the middle, you have the Shulchan Aruch here, in this part here, and around the Shulchan Aruch, you have various perushim, which have been written over the years, which expand on the Shulchan Aruch, question, add on various other details, and the famous perushim, just to show briefly, the Magen Avraham and the Taz at the top here, and you've got the Vilna Gaon down here, Rebbe Akiva Eiger. So, what lies behind the Shulchan Aruch? Why is it so important? How did it achieve its central position and this pivotal role? Before dealing with that, I would like just to deliver a short Dvar Torah on what we're going to read on Shabbat in Shul. We begin to read Sefer Shemot. And the Ran, the famous Ran, asks a very simple question. And he asks as follows: the Sefer Shemot is to do with Bnei Israel who are in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, and it deals with Yetziat Mitzrayim. And the children of Israel were in Egypt for many years, but towards the end, the last 6 months, a year or so, they stopped working and they witnessed all the plagues and the miracles which were being performed on their behalf against Egypt. However, if we look in the Psukim, which we say every morning after in our tefillah, that on Shirat Hayam we say, "Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim meit al Safat Hayam." Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, and then it says in the next pasuk, "Vayaminu b'Hashem v'Moshe Avdo," and they had faith in God and in his servant Moses. The question the Ran asks is, why did they have faith only at this very late stage? There were so many miracles and plagues in Egypt. Why only now? Is it the Torah right? By Yaminu B'Hashem v'Moshe Avdo, they had trust in God and Moshe. And the answer is, as explained by the Ran, that in fact, when they were in Egypt, they had doubts as to Moshe's intention. Why? Because on the one hand, Moshe Rabbeinu was telling them, you are going to leave Egypt. You're going to leave Egypt for good, forever. But on the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to Paro, let my people go for 3 days. Let them go into the wilderness for 3 days. They need to sacrifice to Hashem. They need to take their families with them and their cattle with them for 3 days. So the Bnei Israel weren't exactly convinced what was going on. On the one hand, they're being told they're going out forever. On the other hand, Moshe is telling Pharaoh that they're only going out for 3 days. And there was another reason why they had doubts and they had questions. And that was, they were told that they could take with them the gold and silver and the Rechush Gadol, which had been promised to Abraham, they would take with them when they left Egypt. However, when that happened, was that they came to the crunch point, they were told to borrow. Yisha'alu, they should borrow these things, these gold and silver from the Egyptians. Borrow means give it back. So they had this double message here. On the one hand, they were told they were going to leave for good, and on the other hand, we have the fact that they were being told that it was only going to be for a short time, 3 days or enough for time for them to come back and give back the things they borrowed. So anyway, that was their doubts. So what allayed their concern, what really set their minds at rest, was after they came out of Egypt and after they passed through the Dead Sea safely and after they'd seen that Mitzrayim were dead, they realized what had happened. And this is what the Pasuk says. The Pasuk says, "Vayugad lemelech Mitzrayim," and the Melech, the king of Egypt, was told, "Ki barach ha'am," that the people had fled. And when was he told this? Rashi says, on the third day. On the third day, Pharaoh was told, look, these people are not coming back. And what did he do? He ran after them. Rashi says. So now that they saw the Egyptians were dead, they saw what had actually happened. That Hashem and Moshe have been working on Pharaoh to convince him that they would come back after 3 days. And when, in fact, they didn't come back after 3 days, and they were going away for good, at that point, Pharaoh was going to allow them. That part was not going to allow them to escape. And on the third day, he began chasing them. He was drawn out of Egypt onto the shore of the Red Sea. And once in the Red Sea, they were then seduced to go across the sea to follow the Israelim who traveled across the sea safely. And they were then drawn into the sea, and lo and behold, Moses returned and they were killed. So now that the Bnei Israel could see that this was all part of God's master plan to draw the Egyptians into the sea, they could see that the story of the 3 days was part of the master plan. So they could realize that God's master plan was open to them. They could understand it, and therefore at this stage they said, "Vayaminu b'Hashem v'Moshe Avdo." They had faith in God and in his servant Moshe. So what the lesson to be learned from this is that the divine plans can only be seen with hindsight. Now, this is a most important message, and we have to look back on history to understand God's plans. And this is really the theme of what I want to talk about this evening. Just a moment, I just want to see, maybe see people waiting to come in. Let me just see if I can let them all in. Yes. Okay. I think there may be people waiting to come in. I don't know if anybody else can let them in into the shir. Okay. Anyway, let's continue. So coming back to the Shulchan Aruch, how did it achieve its central position and pivotal role? To answer this, we need some background. The Shulchan Aruch was written in 1563. What were the halachic guidebooks, like the Shulchan Aruch, books of halacha, before the Shulchan Aruch was written? Now, in fact, if you think about it, the Torah itself was a book of halacha. You know, in Sefer Shemot, we're going to start to read on Shabbat. Parshat Yitro, the Parshat Mishpatim are full of commandments. The 10 Commandments in Parshat Yitro and Parshat Mishpatim is full of scores of different commands. Another book which was written after the Torah, which contains the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which at one time was written down at all, but was later written down by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, is the Mishnah. And in the year about 200 of the Common Era, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi arranged and published the Mishnah, and Rabbi Chia arranged the Tosefta, and Rabbi Yehuda composed the Mishnah so that all the halachot would be available to everyone. It could be studied and not be forgotten. So again, this is another book of halachot, is the Mishnah. And from that time onwards, all halachic discussion was based and centered on the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and all halachic debates which took place between the Rabbanim were recorded and arranged in the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli. And that's the two Talmuds we have today. Today we study mainly the Talmud Bavli, but there's also the Yerushalmi as well. So the codes of halacha were also written after that time as well, and in the time of the Gaonim, which was approximately between the time of 650 to 1000 of the Common Era. In Babylon, or Bavel as we call it, there were other Sfarim written about with halachot. And these are some examples enumerated here. Now, we have to also understand how halacha was decided. And we've all heard that halacha was written in and decided by the Chachamim, who were studied in Sura and Pumbedita, the famous yeshivot in Babylon. And they were the major centers of Torah scholarship. And they followed on from the Amoraim, who wrote the Talmud Bavli, obviously in Bavel as well, in Babylonia. And that continued up to the end of the Gaonic period, which is about the 11th century. Bavel was the central authority for halacha for all the Jews around the world, and written halachic questions were sent to the Gaonim in Bavel from communities in distant countries. A written halachic response would then be sent back from Bavel to the country where the question was made. So Bavel was really the center of halacha at that time. However, as time went on, other centers of Torah became established in other places, such as in North Africa, in Spain, in Ashkenaz, in Germany. And questions were increasingly sent to the local rabbinic authorities rather than to Bavel, which was much more distant. And so the influence of Bavel declined at the end of that period in the 11th century. Each Torah center had its own yeshivot, and each with its own method of study, and each with its own method of deciding the halakha. So examples of this is Spain and North Africa. There we had the famous Rabbi Yitzchok al-Fassi, or also known as the Rif, lived in Fez in North Africa and moved eventually to Spain. And the Rambam, the famous Rambam, was born in Spain and died eventually in Egypt. And these were the two preeminent scholars, the Rabbanim, famous Rabbanim, Rishonim, who determined what was going on in these places.
I would say the Rambam is Maimonides, yeah?
Maimonides, indeed, Rambam is Maimonides, correctly. Rambam is Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon. And each one of these famous rabbis, the Rif and the Rambam, wrote a Sefer Halacha, very much like a precursor to the Shulchan Aruch. And just a few more details about it. The Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, he wrote a halachic code known as the Hilchot HaRif, right? And this presents the practical halachic conclusions of the Talmud Bavli. It's written in according to the order of the Talmud Bavli, and states halachot which are applicable today, but in a clear and definitive way. And at that time, the Rif, the Hilchot HaRif, became a standard work. It was widely used. And here I show an example of how the Rif took the halachot from the Gemara. Here I've taken an example of the first 3 pages of Masechet Pesachim. This is Daf Pei Amud Aleph, Beit Gimel Amud Aleph, and Bet Daled Amud Aleph, Bet. And you can see that items here, part of it are shaded in yellow. And these items in the Gemara are the items which provide the halakha after discussion over these pages. So these are pages of discussion, and the decision was made in what's written in the yellow. So the Rif, Yitzhak Alfasi, copied these parts, and he compiled them all together into, you can see his Sefer of Rav Alfasi, and he put them all together, and that in fact comes out to the parts of I've shaded in yellow. So the yellow here in the Sefer of the Rif, in fact, are the parts of the Gemara here which the Rif has selected to include in his Sefer. It adds on a few sentences here and there, but the majority of it, the vast majority, is quotations directly from the Gemara. So that was what the Sefer of the Hilchot HaRif looked like. And the other great Torah work of halacha was, of course, the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam, Maimonides, wrote his halachic code, which was the 14-volume Mishnah Torah, which is very comprehensive. It covers halacha and hashkafa, and includes halachot applicable to all periods, including those halachot at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. Obviously, Rambam lived long after that, but nevertheless, he included in the Mishnah Torah even all the dinim of sacrifices and things like that, which weren't applicable in his day. And also, he covered halacha for all occasions, whether you're in Eretz Israel or whether you're in Chutz La'aretz. Halacha in the Mishnah Torah is arranged by subject matter. It's not arranged by the order of the Talmud, which, as we've seen, the Rif is, and it's written in a very clear manner and written in Hebrew, not in Arabic. The success of the Mishnah Torah was described in the book called Yesod Olam, and I'll just read out what he says. As soon as the work of the Mishnah Torah was made public and distributed throughout the diaspora, all of Israel agreed to rule according to, in all matters of law, rabbinic ordinances, and custom and minhag. So yeah, the Mishnah Torah was very, very influential. So that was what was going on in North Africa, in Spain. Now, in the other part of the Jewish world, in Ashkenaz, in Northern Europe and Northern France, the method of Torah study was dominated by the Tosafot. The Tosafos, we can see every page of the Gemara, you've always got the one side of the page is the Tosafot. And how did the Tosafot work? They analyze the Talmud Bavli in depth and compare and reconcile different sections of the Talmud. Sometimes they question what Rashi says and Rashi's explanations, and they offer alternative. So it was a really analytical point based on the Talmud itself. And the Sifrei Halacha were also written in Ashkenaz, compilations of halachot, and these were widely used, and they were generally based on the halachic decisions of the Tosafot. And here are some examples here in France, in Ashkenaz. I won't read them out because it would take us too long, but you can see there's quite a number of Sepharim. Now, we can see that these two centers of Torah learning each had its own derech limud. On the one hand, Spain and North Africa were based on the established halachic codes, the halachic books of the Rif and the Rambam. Whereas in Ashkenaz, in Germany and Northern Europe, these were based on the Tosfos approach to Talmud-based learning. And these two centers in Spain, North Africa, and in Northern Europe, these two centers developed their Torah learning quite separately. There was some cross-learning as scholars from Spain and southern France traveled to study in northern France and vice versa. So to some extent, the knowledge of the Tosfot spread southwards towards Spain and North Africa, while the writings of the Rif and the Rambam became known in Ashkenaz. This took time, and as people traveled, and the writings of these great Chachamim became known more widely. This cross-learning was particularly noticeable in the Torah centers in northern Spain, southern Spain, in Barcelona and Girona, and in southern France and Provence. These two areas lay geographically sort of halfway between southern Spain, Castilla, and Germany, northern France, in northern Europe. So, now, what was actually going in southern Spain, which of course is where the Rambam came from, there was an awareness, and the influence of the Tosfot was very limited. But however, in contrast, in Ashkenaz, in Germany, northern France, the work of the Rambam and the Rif were known. And Reb Meir of Rothenburg, who I'm sure you've heard of, we'll talk about in a few minutes more extensively. Reb Meir of Rothenburg, also known as the Maharam, he was the last generation of the Tosafot, and his Talmidim, three of his pupils, wrote very important commentaries. So these were Ashkenazi commentaries on the Rif and the Rambam. So we see that Hagot Maimonides, which is the Maimonides, which are written in every page of the Mishnah Torah, standard editions, came from Ashkenazi Perushim. And similarly, on the Rif, the Mordechai is a standard Perush on the Rif. You'll find it in the back of any Gemara. And these are written by Ashkenazi Talmidim of the Maharam Rothenburg. And Reb Osher ben Yechiel, known as the Rosh, he wrote his Piskei HaRosh. There's also a commentary on the Hilchot HaRif. So we can see that the famous compilations of halachot of the Rif and the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, traveled northwards, were accepted in Ashkenaz and were commented on and studied. Now, there was all background, but I really want to start a story from here, from Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, the Maharam. We're not going to talk about Meir, and this is the year he lived, 1220 to 1293, and also his Talmid and successor, the Reb Osher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, who lived 1250 to 1327. The Maharam was the leading authority in Ashkenaz. And say he was one of the last Balei Tosfot. And well known, he was imprisoned in 1286 by the Emperor Rudolf of Habsburg and held for ransom. These kings were desperate for money, and they now knew that the Jews had money, and the best way to do it is take the most important Jew, the chief rabbi, and use him for ransom. And the head of the government then held the Rosh himself as being responsible for raising the ransom money. Now, the Maharam of Rothenburg forbade his people to ransom him. Why? He said, I don't want you to pay any money to get my release. Why? Because if you do so, you'll only encourage the Goyim to, in other places, to take other Jewish leaders and try and extract more money for ransom. And therefore, he forbade his pupils, he forbade the Jewish people to redeem him. And eventually, he died in prison in 1293. His body was eventually ransomed and buried in 1307. But then he died
in Worms, in Wormaisa, and the person who paid for his ransom is buried next to him.
Very true, Frank, very true, very true. And he's buried next to him. You can visit it today in Worms. Now, as a result of all this, the Rosh then became a target for ransom. And so he fled from Germany with his family in 1304. He traveled southwards through Provence in southern France. He then went his way into northern Spain, into Barcelona, where he met the Rashba. And the Rashba recommended that the Rosh take up the position of the rabbi of Toledo in southern Spain. And the Rosh was the very, very famous rabbi. And therefore, you can see on this map how he traveled from Germany up here, southward through Provence, onto Barcelona in northern Spain, and ending up in Toledo here. And this map here, which was taken from a book by Martin Gilbert, shows the locations of where the Jews lived up till the time of the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula, 1492, 97. And you can see Portugal and Spain here. And you can see there are many, many cities which had substantial Jewish populations. The famous ones are Barcelona and Girona up here, centers of great Jewish learning. Famous rabbis came from here. The central part, Toledo, is in the center of the peninsula here, which is the capital of Castile, as you can see, Castile. And the southern part, you've got places called like Cordova and Granada and Seville. That's where the Rambam was born, Rimi Gash and other famous Talmidei Chachamim. So this is the Rosh, and he ends up now in Toledo. This is a picture of Toledo of today. You can see there's a river down here. I've actually visited here with my wife some years ago, and you can see the old city up here on the hill. And this is a map of the Jewish quarter. You see the river here, and this was the Jewish quarter at the time before the expulsion from Spain. So up here was the Jewish quarter. You can see the walls of the city of today. And if you visit Toledo, and I'd recommend anybody who has the opportunity to do so, you'll find there buildings which at one time were shuls. They were Bate Knesset from before the time of the expulsion. And this is one of the Ibn Shoshan synagogue, first built in 1180. You can see what a magnificent building this is, a beautiful building. And it is now taken over by the church. Unfortunately, they've taken our property, but you can go in there. And I was in there with my wife some years ago. It's a beautiful building. Another shul which exists in Toledo is the shul called of Shmuel Hanavi. This was built in 1360, and this is a magnificent shul. You can see it here from the outside. As you go in, beautiful work of the shul here. Yes, Frank. Yeah, you can see the beautiful shul, the work here. You can look at the ceiling. Look at that magnificent work. And these are photographs of today. You can go visit it today. It's a museum. And if you look carefully at the top of the wall here, just below the ceiling, you can see Pesukim, which are written on the wall today in golden letters. Beautiful. And these are Pesukim are from Tehillim. These are Perek Pei Dalet, are actually written here on the frieze. So when the Rosh arrived in Toledo in 1305, from a learning point of view, this is what he found. he found that the study of the Talmud and the Tosfot was almost non-existent. The world he came from, which was the world of Tosfot, didn't exist very much in Toledo. And the halacha was being decided according to the Rambam's Mishnah Torah and the Hilchot Arif, but not according to any other opinions. So he was concerned about this. And if I just divert for a moment from the Rosh, but going back to the Rambam, we have to know what the Rambam's intention was when he wrote the Mishnah Torah. And his intentions are written in the Rambam wrote in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, why he wrote it. And he made several points. Point number one, that the Mishnah Torah was written as a safeguard against the decline in scholarship. He says we've been beset by additional difficulties and the comprehension of our wise men has declined. Therefore, these laws and replies which the Gonim have composed have become difficult for us to grasp, and only a select few can comprehend these matters in a proper way. That's what the Rambam wrote. The second purpose of the Mishnah Torah Rambam wrote was to provide authoritative, clear rulings without the need to consult any other text. That a person will not need to consult any other text at all with regard to any Jewish law. This is what he wrote. And the third point, which he wrote, of the purpose, the scope of the Mishnah Torah, was to cover all topics covered in the Talmud, as well as the more recent decisions of the Gonim. So this text, the Mishnah Torah, will be a compilation of the entire oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, including all the dinim and the customs and the takanot, which were enacted from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the completion of the Talmud, and as explained by the Gonim in the text that they wrote after the Talmud. In other words, the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says, was designed to be a standalone authority on its own right. It provided no sources for the stated halachot. It doesn't say where they came from. This is the halacha, and Rambam doesn't say where they came from. And he also omitted all references to differing opinions. So even though in the Gemara perhaps there were different opinions, the Rambam doesn't refer to that. He just says, this is the halacha. So when the Rosh came to Spain, came to Toledo, he found that this was the atmosphere. And you can read about the Rosh's attitude towards the Mishnah Torah by, in fact, what the Rosh wrote about this himself and from his Teshuvot. A lot of work done by Yehuda Galinsky in this field. All who decide halachot based exclusively on the writings of the Rambam without thoroughly knowing what is written in the Talmud and the basis for the Rambam's law, they will err. They will make a mistake in deciding the law. This is what the Rosh writes. If you're depending only on the Rambam and not going back to the Talmud and the sources for the Rambam. He writes this again, relying solely on the works of these writings without being familiar at all with the corresponding Talmudic sources. Incorrect decisions will be made due to failure to detect scribe errors or because the reader did not comprehend the writer's intent. So the Rosh was faced with a twofold challenge. Number one, how to broaden the curriculum taught in the local yeshiva to include Talmud study, and secondly, how to broaden the local rabbis' halachic decision-making procedures to incorporate other opinions, to take into account not only the opinion of the Rif and the Rambam, but other great opinions as well. And this is what the Rosh was faced this twofold challenge. Now, the first challenge on how to broaden the curriculum and to make sure that the Talmud study would be incorporated in the yeshivot. He met the first challenge by broadening the educational curriculum by authoring two new works. He wrote a commentary on the Talmud, the Teves Aruch, which is based on the authorized Tosfot that's used in Ashkenaz in Germany, the teachings of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, his teacher, his Rebbe, and the teaching of also of other Spanish sages, such as the Ramban and Rabbi Meir of Fulia of the Ramah, he quoted these in his works. And the other thing that the Rosh did was that the Rosh edited the Hilchot Arif. So for each halacha of the Rif, the Rosh added alternative opinions for understanding the relevant section of the Talmud and resulting halacha. So the Piskei HaRosh was effectively a supplement to the Hilchot Arif. This is what the Rosh wrote on top of the Rif. And just to show an example of this, this is the 6 pages we saw before of Masechet Pesachim, and we saw how the Rif had compiled his Sefer, the Hilchot Arif, based on the things which are in yellow, which were extracted from the Gemara. This we saw above. And now this is where the Rosh comes in. The Rosh, this is the Rabbeinu Asher, yes, just as a copy of one of the pages in the back of the Gemara, with this Perush of the Rosh. And you can see here that this Perush is, what's in yellow is the Rif. It's exactly what we have it in the Rif here, just written in a slightly different format here, is in yellow. But there's a gap in it. You see the gap here. The gap is what the Rosh added. So he stopped the Rif here at this point. He added in his comments here and then continued with the next stage of the Rif. And so he went on. That's how the Rabbeinu Asher looks like. So this particular example here, where you can see the gap of what he adds in, he includes comments from the Tosfot Hari, from the Ritz Geos, which is another Spanish commentary, and also a quotation from the Talmud Yerushalmi he brought in here. Yerushalmi, you can see. And he also, in blue, the Rosh introduced into the commentary, onto the Rif, actually various lines in the Gemara. This is the Gemara. And the yellow is what the Rif took. But the Rosh felt that there were other parts of the Gemara which should have been quoted as well to make the relevant halachot. And so he included the parts in blue, he included himself in his Perush on the Rif. So this is what the Rosh did. And as we said, so we now then come to the next stage. As we mentioned above, the Rosh was faced with a second challenge. So the first challenge of broadening the educational basis, he did that by writing books and getting those wider study basis for the Talmidim in the yeshiva. However, the second point, which the challenge was how to broaden the local rabbinate's halachic decision-making procedures, how he could make the chachamim, when they make the halachot, deciding halachot of psak din, to take into account not only the Rambam and the Rif. And the Rosh did not compose another work to counter this second challenge. However, his son, Rabbi Yaakov, would play an important role in this by writing a new Sefer Halacha, a new code of law, which is the Arba Turim. This is what Frank referred to a few minutes ago. The Arba Turim, the Tur, and he wrote this in approximately 1340, he finished this work. The Arba Turim would play a most important role in making halachic decisions by making available a range of halachic opinions, both from Ashkenaz, from Spain, and from elsewhere, so that the person who wants to make a halachic decision would have in front of him the different opinions, not only the Rambam and the Rif, but other scholars as well, be they from Ashkenaz, be they from Spain or elsewhere. And the Arba Turim, why is it called the 4 rows, Turim, the 4 rows? Because this is how Rabbi Yaakov arranged it. And he arranged it in the 4 sections, the 4 Turim, as well as Orech Chaim, is the laws of prayer and synagogue on a daily basis. The Yoredea, miscellaneous laws we've seen above, kashrut, idolatry, charity, study of mourning, Evan Ezer, marital laws, and Chosh Mishpat and Manashi law. And of course, the Arba Turim, you will see straight away, is a precursor to the Shulchan Aruch. And if we then look at what actually happened when Rabbi Yaakov was writing his book, when writing the Arba Turim, his new code of law. Rabbi Yaakov had before him the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, on which to model his new work. And yet he chose not to model the Arbaturim on the Mishnah Torah at all, but organized his Arbaturim in a distinctly different way. So while the Arbaturim and the Rambam's Mishnah Torah are both halachic reference books, they differ considerably in scope, because the Arbaturim is of limited scope. It deals most exclusively with halachot which are applicable in his day, not in Chutz La'aretz. Whereas the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is all-encompassing. It includes halachot for all time, the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, of Karbanot, and things like this, and all places, the dinim of both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. The second difference between the Arbaturim and the Mishnah Torah is the way they are arranged. The Arbaturim, and particularly Orach Chaim, presents the halachot chronologically, halachot from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. To shacharit, when you come out of bed, mincha, ma'ariv, how you conduct business. And then for the week, every Shabbat, they have hilchot Shabbat, and then hilchot for Rosh Chodesh, and hilchot for the year of the Chagim. That's the order in which the Arbaturim is written. Whereas the Mishnah Torah presents halachic content by subject. Each subject is dealt on its own, it's not necessarily chronological. So the Arbaturim decided to have a different sequence in which to write the halachot. And the other major difference between these two books was that for any particular halacha is the way in which halachic decisions were presented. The Arbaturim often quotes different opinions. It does not even provide a finalized psak. Sometimes it refers to what his father, the Rosh, decided, but basically he brings 2, 3, 4, 5 opinions and leaves it at that. And the Mishnah Torah, however, only defines a single definitive psak for each halacha and does not refer to alternative opinions at all. In common, what they do have is that neither the Arbaturim nor the Mishnah Torah quotes source references. Neither of them do. Now, once Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, had written his Arbaturim, on his publication in about 1340, the Arbaturim was widely accepted in Spain and became a standard work for halacha. It was quoted widely in other works. It was easy to use and to find any halacha being sought. I had a list of contents and a summary. Copies of manuscripts of the Arbaturim were made in Portugal, Provence, Byzantium, today's Turkey, and even in Yerushalayim in the 14th century. And then later on, when printing came about, several printed versions of the parts of the Arbaturim were published in Spain and Portugal, even before the expulsion. And Jews who were refugees from Spain set up a printing house in Constantinople, and they chose the Arbaturim as their first publication. And 6 editions were printed in Italy in this period. All this showed the popularity of the Arbaturim in Southern Europe. And printers in Spain and Italy sold their publication in both Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities. So it spread throughout the whole of the Jewish world, including Northern Europe. Thus, the Arbaturim became an authoritative work in its own right. It was widely distributed and became the de facto reference for practical halacha throughout Europe. What were the reactions to the Arbaturim? There were 2 major reactions. The first one is of the reaction of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was born in Spain as a child, left Spain and was part of the Girush Misfarad, ended up in living in Sfat. The Rabbi Yosef Karo wanted to write a comprehensive summary of all the opinions on any particular halacha. This is what he wanted to do, quite independent of anything else. And this would include, this is what he writes in his introduction to his Sefer the Beit Yosef, that all relevant quotations, he wants to bring all relevant quotations from the Talmud and all its commentators. He wants to bring them all in a large reference book, all references and all relevant decisions for every halacha. He called this work, this book he was writing, the Beit Yosef, obviously the play on his own name, Yosef. And he based it on the Arba Turim. Why did he choose the Arba Turim as the basis for this his work, the Beit Yosef? Because he wanted to append his halachic summary to one of the established halachic codes. He writes that he considered doing it based on the Rambam, but rejected this option as the Rambam brings only one opinion for each halacha, whereas the Arba Turim brings many opinions. And he appended his summary to the Arba Turim as it quotes most of the available opinions in each halacha. And as part of this summary of opinions for each halacha, Rabbi Yosef Karo appended his own halachic conclusion. In other words, he brings a particular subject, a particular halacha, he brings different opinions and the sources of what the different opinions wrote, and then he would conclude with his own conclusion. I think, selecting from all these different halachot, these different opinions, the halacha should be so and so. And he described how he would choose which halacha, which opinion to select. And he said his final halachic decisions were based on just the opinions of the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, and would exclude the opinions of other authorities. That's in arriving in his recommended halacha for this point. Rabbi Yosef Karo began writing the Beit Yosef in 1522, and it was published some 30 years later in 1552. So you can see that this is the approach of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And it so happened, Rabbi Yosef Karo was in Eretz Yisrael in Sfat, a long way away in Poland, in Krakow, was Reb Moshe Isserlis, a very famous Rav. And he also, like Rabbi Yosef Karo, felt there was a need for a comprehensive summary of all the opinions on any particular halacha. So he proceeded to write his work, the Darkei Moshe, which he called it, which was also based on the Arba Turim. And he wasn't aware initially that Rabbi Yosef Karo was writing a similar work. And having completed a sizable part of his book, the Darkei Moshe, he then became aware of the Beit Yosef, which was now being published. And he was very impressed by the Beit Yosef and decided to stop writing his own book. And this is what he writes in his introduction. And he says, although I was disappointed that his own work had been superseded, on further thought, he decided that he still had a major contribution to make over and above the Beit Yosef in several ways. In what way? He felt that the Beit Yosef was incomplete, in that it did not reference the latest Ashkenazi or poskim or minhagim. Understandably, because Rabbi Yosef Karo was living a long way from Ashkenaz and possibly not aware of this. He disagreed with the methods used in the Beit Yosef to arrive at a final halachic decision, in that the Beit Yosef was based the decisions, as we mentioned above, only on the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh. And Reb Moshe Isserlis held that the opinions of other poskim must also be taken into account. So he then adapted his work, the Darkei Moshe, the Ramah, known as the Ramah, to be a concise addendum to the Beit Yosef, covering these additional points. So in other words, he deliberately wrote over and above what he felt the Beit Yosef had omitted. And if you look at any edition today of the Arba Turim, and this is the Arba Turim here in the middle, you will find standard Perushim, and here you see the Beit Yosef, which is down here as an expansion to the tour here, and you'll see the Darkei Moshe down here as an additional comment onto the Beit Yosef with regard to the Arba Turim, the Ramah's Darkei Moshe. So that's what happened there. In other words, we had additional comments, written based on the Arba Turim of the Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh. However, the Beit Yosef was a very large and detailed reference work, and it wasn't so easy to use for quick reference. It was very, very broad, encyclopedic piece of work. So Rabbi Yosef Karo also wanted to provide a halachic reference guide for general use. It should be concise and authoritative, and written in a simple and clear style suitable for every layman to use. For this, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch as a summary of the Beit Yosef. And the Shulchan Aruch, as we know, has the same structure as the Arba Turim. It's based on the Arba Turim, namely the 4 volumes of the Orech Chaim, Yerodea, the Even Ezer, and the Choshen Mishpat. And in 1563, some 10 years after he published the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo published his Shulchan Aruch. Now, well, what did Rabbi Moshe Isserles do? He'd written his Darkei Moshe, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles reacted positively to the Shulchan Aruch. He thought it was a wonderful idea to have a summary book. And you see that the Beit Yosef, the Moshe Isserles, decided to write another further perush in the same way as the Shulchan Aruch wrote a very brief summary of the Beit Yosef. So Rabbi Moshe Isserles wrote a brief summary of which was on his comments, which is called the Mappa, and I'll show you in a moment what he means. So, because the Shulchan Aruch still had the same limitations, it didn't reference the latest Ashkenazi poskim or mention local Ashkenazi customs or practices, and he also agreed in some cases with the final halachic decision of the Shulchan Aruch, as these were based just on the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, and don't take into account other opinions. So therefore, he enhanced the Shulchan Aruch by adding his own comments, which he called Hamapah, the tablecloth, and he added these as text onto the Shulchan Aruch. And as he writes in his introduction to the Mapah, he writes, Bati acharav lifros Mapah al Shulchan Aruch. I followed him to spread my tablecloth over his table, the table of the Rabbi Yosef Karo. And this shows an example of
the cover table, yes?
Cover the tablecloth over the table. And this is what he did. So here we have, this is what we showed above before. This again is the Shulchan Aruch, the dinim of Sukkah. The Shulchan Aruch, again, all the seifim, point by point of the different halachot. And here you have in blue, which I've highlighted in blue, the addition made by the Ramah, Reb Moshe Isserles, in his perush called the Mapah, where he adds on his own comments to not all, but into some halachot, which says there may be a different opinion, a different minhag, and this is what we have. So any Shulchan Aruch you open today will have the Shulchan Aruch himself, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and written in line with it, the opinions of the Ramah for the Ashkenazi. And if you look in a standard format of the Shulchan Aruch, this is the same page that we saw above, you'll see here the Hilchot Sukkah over here, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, the different dinim. You can see written here the opinion of, this is the Shulchan Aruch itself, and here in Bet you can see the Ramah has added, which is written, usually begins with Haga'ah, Hey, Gimel, Hey, and his opinion about this particular halacha either adds a different point or sometimes it disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch itself. So there we are. So this is how we have arrived at the Shulchan Aruch of today. That's its story. So the Shulchan Aruch has been the mainstay of Jewish life for the last 450 years. And it remains as the central halachic reference point for any halacha. There's nobody who studies halacha who doesn't start off with the Shulchan Aruch. And when we look at how the Shulchan Aruch came into being, we can perhaps discern a divine plan which brought it about. How we have Rebbe Meir of Rothenburg having to spend his final years in captivity. and the Rosh having to flee from Germany and Ashkenaz, and having to overcome the challenges of reconciling different traditions in Toledo, and the involvement of into the Arba Turim, all this together resulted eventually in the Shulchan Aruch. So in the same way as we learned at the beginning of our talk this evening about the Kriyat Yam Suf, when we discussed how the divine plan only sometimes is only discernible with hindsight. So that's the story of the Shulchan Aruch, and I believe this is the plan of Hashem. The Shulchan Aruch should be our mainstay of Jewish life, and all these unpleasant things, sometimes unpleasant things happen, but the end result is what we have. Thank you. I'd welcome any questions, anybody wants to make any comments. Delighted we have a few minutes left.
Oh, thank you very much. I think you've brought a clear view of the development of the halakha. Yes, and this could be the base for many people understanding how the halakha was developed, yeah, from the base of the Torah through the Meforshim, Rashi, and basing the Mishnah, and yeah, this way I think your shiur gave a very broad view and understanding how things develop. And
thank you. I think what's important though is that when we open a Shulchan Aruch, we should realize what lies behind the Shulchan Aruch. It's all these great Rabbanim who together over the years have worked together, and it's not just something just written down. There's a great basis for it from the time of the Mishnah, from the Gemara, and great Jewish minds, great Rabbanim have given their mind to all these halachot and how they've finalized them, how they've come into a final conclusion. And we can also understand how the different minhagim between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and even within the Ashkenazi world, there are different minhagim. We can see the basis is to be found in the Shulchan Aruch.
Yeah, and I think when on this in the same line, I would say even today, a lot of very important rabbis are sitting down together and discussing this matter and trying to apply today's worlds in the halakha, and the halakha on this special
True. You can see this by the number of halachic books which have been written since the Shulchan Aruch. Yes. All these Perushim and other books, but they're all based on the Shulchan Aruch, and they talk about new cases and the Shayas Shuvot, the famous Rabbanim, have all based on the Shulchan Aruch is their baseline. So there we are. Anyway, right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
State the former speaker, Rav Evers, who's written a set of Shutim, Shelot, questions and answers from Holland on all kind of halachic problems. Yes, yes,
indeed.
Which I've got in my library as well. And when you come to see me, I can show them to you. Yes,
I'm very interested to see that. Thank you, Frank. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Have a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.